Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are undertaking a mission, a really deep dive into one of the most, I think, intellectually demanding texts in all of philosophy.
Oh, for sure.
Baruch Spinoza's Ethics. Now, if you've ever tried to read it, you know it can feel like trying to decrypt the universe,
Yeah,
but written in, I don't know, a dead language.
that's a good way to put it.
So our job, our mission today, is to take his foundational principles, his ideas about God, freedom, the mind, and make them crystal clear. We're looking for the core nuggets of his genius.
And the first thing that hits you, right, is the style.
Exactly. The first thing anyone notices about the Ethics is just how intimidating it looks on the page. It's laid out more geometrical. The geometrical method. It's a system of definitions, axioms, propositions. It looks like a high school geometry textbook.
And that's completely intentional. That aesthetic choice is Spinoza's entire opening statement. He is declaring that his philosophy proceeds with the same logical necessity as mathematics.
So he's not just offering opinions.
Not at all. He's not giving you conjectures. He's trying to show you that his conclusions about reality, about our place in it, they follow necessarily from a self-evident starting point. It's like when Euclid proves the angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees.
There's no room for debate.
There's no possibility of error. Spinoza is claiming that same level of absolute certainty for his entire metaphysical system.
That right there sets the philosophical stakes astronomically high. We're talking about necessary truth. But, before we dive into that rigorous structure, we have to understand the man. Who was Spinoza? Why did he feel the need to build his views, which were called unparalleled audacity, with such rigor?
Well, Spinoza's life was really defined by isolation, both intellectual and social. He was born into the Portuguese Jewish community in 17th century Amsterdam, which was this amazing hub of commerce and new ideas. But his own ideas, they very quickly put him at odds with traditional thought.
Right, and in 1656, when he was just 23, he was excommunicated.
He was subject to a cherem, which was a public and, frankly, devastating rupture from his community.
A public rupture sounds intense.
Mm.
Can you paint a picture of how serious this was? Was it purely about theology?
It was incredibly severe. The cherem wasn't just, being quietly taken off the synagogue rolls. It was a public cursing, a permanent ban. It forbade anyone to speak to him, to read his writings, or even to come within a certain distance of him.
Wow.
The official charges were vague, something about evil ways and deeds, but the root cause, according to his earliest biographers, was a fundamental lack of respect for the authority of Moses and the law. But, modern scholars also suggest it was tangled up in some complex financial and legal issues around his father's estate. But whatever the full reason, the effect was profound. Spinoza was forced out.
So, exiled by his own community, he then pursues a life of absolute intellectual independence.
Exactly. He turned down lucrative academic jobs because he knew that accepting a salary would compromise his freedom to think and write what he wanted. He supported himself by grinding optical lenses, a manual craft, and he lived this simple, almost ascetic life.
And that gave him the freedom to work on his masterpiece.
It did. It allowed him to finish the Ethics around 1675. But because of the political hostility around his earlier works, which were all about intellectual freedom and critiquing religious authority, he very wisely decided not to publish it.
So it only came out after he died.
Yes, posthumously in 1677, published by his friends, his entire system, which broke so fundamentally with figures like Descartes, was built completely outside the constraints of established power.
That context is so crucial. He's an outsider, building a philosophy for the entire universe, not for the academy or for the church. Okay, let's unpack that starting point, the foundation of that whole geometric structure, the single substance. When we talk about substance, is Spinoza asking us to just throw out everything we thought we knew about what stuff is? Because for someone like Descartes, there were at least three: God, mind, and matter.
Right.
But Spinoza comes along with a definition that just immediately cuts the universe down to one.
He fundamentally redefines the term. For Spinoza, substance is, by definition, that which exists in itself and is conceived through itself.
In itself and conceived through itself.
Think of it as the ultimate reality. It's totally self-sufficient. It requires nothing else for its existence or even for you to understand what it is. Everything else he calls a mode.
A mode.
And a mode is the opposite. It exists in something else and has to be conceived through that other thing.
That's a really powerful distinction. So if something needs nothing else to exist, it's a substance. But if it requires something else like, say, air or a planet or the laws of nature, It's just a mode.
That's it. And that distinction is the engine for his whole substance monism. He argues, with this incredible metaphysical rigor, that if you had two substances, they'd have to share some defining characteristic, some attribute.
Right.
But if they shared that attribute, they would necessarily limit each other. That would mean you'd have to conceive of them through each other, which violates the fundamental definition of a substance.
Which has to be conceived through itself.
Exactly. So the logical conclusion is inescapable. There can only be one substance in the universe, and this substance must be absolutely infinite.
And this one, infinite substance, is what he calls God, which leads to that famous phrase you always hear, de causa natura, God, or nature. That seems to be the key to everything.
It is the hinge upon which the entire system turns. By identifying God with nature, with the sum total of all reality, Spinoza is making a radical break from traditional theology. For him, God isn't a personality or a cosmic clockmaker or a judge outside the world.
God is the world.
God is the physical world, the mental world, and the necessary underlying cause of everything.
So if God is substance and the very essence of substance involves existence, then God necessarily exists. It's not a matter of faith. It's a logical certainty, like 2 + 2 = 4.
Precisely. To say God does not exist is a logical contradiction in Spinoza's system. It's incoherent. And this single substance, this God or nature, it manifests in two related ways that scholars use to explain it: natura naturans and natura naturata.
Okay, let's spend a minute on those two, because they sound a bit tricky. But they seem to clarify how this eternal foundation relates to the changing world we all experience. What's natura matrans?
So natura naturans, which literally means naturing or nature nurturing, is the active, internal, necessary cause of everything. This is God as substance itself. It's eternal, infinite, and made up of infinite attributes. It's the uncaused cause. Think of it as the eternal operating system of reality.
The fundamental law.
The unchanging, necessary foundation that dictates how reality unfolds.
And then naturata, natured is the result of that process.
Yes, naturata is absolutely everything that follows necessarily from naturans. So all the particular finite things, the mountains, the rivers, you, me, our minds, the galaxies, these are the modes.
The specific modification.
Exactly. So if natura naturans is the foundational operating system of the universe, naturata is every single application, every process, every line of code running on that system. The whole universe is just a necessary caused consequence of God's supreme infinite power.
This leads us right to the attributes. If God is absolutely infinite, he has to have an infinite number of these attributes, which are the ways the intellect perceives substance as making up its essence. But we, as human modes, we only know two.
We only know two: thought and extension, mind and matter.
Right. And this is where he really gets interesting, because he's directly responding to Descartes here.
He is. Descartes saw thought and extension as two totally separate, distinct substances. Spinoza says no, they are not two substances. They are just two different ways that we apprehend the same single reality. The one vast substance is expressing itself mentally and physically at the same time.
And in infinitely many other ways that we can't even perceive.
Exactly. We can't even begin to grasp them.
So if I'm looking at a tree, I'm seeing a mode of the attribute of extension. If I think about the idea of that tree, that idea is a mode of the attribute of thought.
Perfect.
But both are just expressions of the same underlying reality, the same substance, just viewed through a different lens.
Precisely. And we should pause on this idea of infinity. When Spinoza says God has an infinite number of infinite attributes, he means an infinity that precedes its objects. It's not just counting to a really big number. This infinity is active, it's generative. It suggests a continuous, eternal flow of being. The universe isn't a static picture for him. It's the infinite dynamic process of this one substance expressing its nature.
So let's circle back to the modes. Everything we experience, your hand, the sound of my voice, a memory, is a finite mode. Why do we instinctively treat them as if they're separate, autonomous things?
It's because of our limited perspective. We mistakenly think of finite things as substances because we perceive them as having some relative stability, right? We can define them on their own terms, or so we think.
But Spinoza says we're wrong.
He argues, with metaphysical rigor, that we are wrong. A finite thing, like a human body, is just a temporary pattern, a specific ratio of motion and rest that is completely dependent on the infinite causal order of nature. If you try to define your body apart from the entire universe, you're only looking at a confused, inadequate surface. We are nothing but temporary affections of God's attributes.
That sounds both beautiful and, I have to say, profoundly unsettling. If I am just a modification of God, a property of God, it raises that classic philosophical problem. How can God be perfect if God has contradictory properties? How can the perfect immutable substance include, the transient, the miserable, the destructive?
That is the essential challenge, the main critique leveled against Spinoza's monism. Critics say if God includes everything, then God must include imperfection and contradiction.
So what's his retort?
His defense rests entirely on that distinction between an attribute and a mode. God's perfection and immutability are in the attributes. Thought and extension themselves are eternal and unchanging. The variability, the sadness, the joy, the motion, the rest, all of that happens only at the level of the finite modes.
Ah,
A sad person is just a temporary affection of the attribute of thought. Their sadness is determined by external causes, and it's transient. The substance itself, God, remains eternally perfect and immutable in its essence. The mode's imperfection is just its finitude, its confusion. It's not a flaw in the infinite foundation it flows from.
so the problem isn't in God, but in our limited modal perspective of God, we're mistaking a small, fluctuating part for the eternal whole.
Exactly. Moving on from the structure of substance, we have to get into the logic that governs its existence and its relationship to all those modes. And Spinoza's view of existence here is it's revolutionary, especially when we contrast eternity with duration.
I think I understand eternity in a religious sense, but how does Spinoza define it so rigorously?
For Spinoza, eternity is existence that is conceived to follow necessarily and solely from the definition or essence of the thing itself. It is purely non-temporal existence.
So it's outside of time.
Completely. This is the exclusive mode of being for God. God's essence is existence. There is no before or after for God.
So if that's eternity, what is duration?
Duration is the contingent remaining of a thing in existence, its persistence. For all finite things, all the modes, their existence isn't guaranteed by their essence alone. Their existence is only possible based on their definition. Their actual duration, how long they last, is entirely dependent on external causes.
So duration is an activity.
It is an active state, the constant struggling activity of persisting in being.
If duration is this activity of persisting, where does our everyday concept of time fit into this? We use it constantly to measure duration.
Spinoza is pretty blunt about this. For him, time is just an extrinsic, finite duration. It's a way we measure one duration in relation to another, like comparing how long something lasts to the swing of a pendulum or the hands on a clock.
So it's not real.
He calls it a being of reason, an ens rationis. It's a helpful, practical tool for organizing our limited, confused perceptions of duration, but it has no objective reality in the eternal nature of things.
That's a fascinating inversion. Time is just a tool of human confusion. But the eternity is absolutely real, the necessary foundation. And this brings us back to his confidence in defining God as a cause of itself, or causa sui.
The causa sui is the keystone of the whole structure. God is the efficient cause of itself through its own essence. And we have to appreciate just how radical this was in the 17th century.
Right, because other thinkers shied away from that.
They really did. Thinkers like Descartes, they struggled with it. They might say God is the cause of himself in some analogous way, or that God conserves himself, but they were very hesitant to say God is the efficient cause. That suggests an active causal power exerted on oneself.
But Spinoza just goes for it.
He rejects all that hedging. Since substance must be the ultimate foundation, and since everything has to have an efficient cause, the substance itself must be its own cause. It is self-generating and self-sustaining by sheer logical necessity.
If God is this necessary self-caused reality and everything else flows necessarily from God, this establishes Spinoza's most controversial conclusion: thoroughgoing determinism, or necessitarianism. Is there anything at all that isn't absolutely fixed?
Nothing. Spinoza's system operates under the strict principle of sufficient reason. For everything that exists, there must be a cause or reason for its existence or for its non-existence.
And that applies to everything.
Universally.
Yeah.
And the consequence is devastating for traditional ideas of contingency. Everything that happens, happens necessarily. The actual universe we live in is the only possible universe that could exist, flowing from the infinite nature of God.
So wait. The rolling of dice, the collapse of an empire, the exact moment I raised my hand to make this point. It was all from the beginning of time, locked in and necessary.
Absolutely. What we call possibility is merely a function of our ignorance. We say something is possible when we don't know the precise chain of causes that will necessitate it. If we could perceive the infinite chain of causes stretching back to God's attributes, we'd see that every single event, every mode, every particular has been fixed eternally.
And if everything is determined, that just annihilates the idea of human free will. So how does Spinoza account for the overwhelming human experience of feeling free? I mean, I feel like I chose to have coffee this morning.
Spinoza dismisses the idea of an absolute or free will as an incoherent fantasy. He calls it a dominion within a dominion. This absurd idea that the human mind, which is just a mode, somehow exists outside the causal laws that govern the rest of nature.
So why do we feel free?
We feel free precisely because we are conscious of our immediate actions and desires, but we are almost completely ignorant of the antecedent causes that determined us to act or desire that way.
I see.
Your choice to have coffee this morning was determined by a massive, infinite web of causes. Your physiological state, your past habits, the availability of the coffee, neural patterns firing in your brain seconds before the thought even emerged. And you didn't consciously choose any of them.
This is a heavy idea. If I'm determined to desire something and I act on it, am I essentially just a sophisticated automaton? Does that mean there's no moral difference between a person who acts rationally and one who acts destructively?
It means they are both equally necessitated by the order of nature. But, and this is crucial, the difference lies in the type of cause that's determining them. The person acting destructively is determined primarily by external causes, passions, inadequate ideas, forces outside their own essence.
Okay.
The person acting rationally is determined by internal causes, by the necessity of their own nature as it strives to preserve itself through adequate knowledge. And this distinction between internal and external determination is the whole foundation for his ethics, which we'll get to. But the necessity remains absolute in all cases.
If everything is continuous and determined, then human nature can't be some special exception to the laws of nature, which is what so many philosophers before him claimed.
Exactly.
Spinoza brings the human being, this singular mode, right back into the scientific fold.
Exactly. Spinoza's anthropology is revolutionary because it tries to solve the mind-body problem by basically denying the problem even exists. He just rejects the dualism that plagued his predecessors.
He affirms an identity. The body, which is a mode of extension, and the mind, the idea of that body, a mode of thought, are one and the same thing expressed in two ways.
This is the critical insight, and we shouldn't think of them as parallel tracks. That implies two separate things running alongside each other. Spinoza means the mind is simply the idea of the body.
So they're not interacting.
They're not interacting because they are the same thing. Any state the body is in is mirrored perfectly in the mind as an idea, and vice versa. They are two distinct expressions of a single unified mode. So a body that can be disposed in many complex ways, that can receive and process many external impressions, necessarily has a mind that can perceive many things at once.
What?
The physical complexity of the body is the mental complexity of the mind.
This unified view leads us to the driving force of every single mode in nature, the conatus, or striving. It sounds like Spinoza's version of a will to live.
It's the essence of existence for any finite mode. The conatus is the power by which every single thing strives to persevere in its own being. It's an internal, self-affirming force. A thing's essence only affirms its existence. It contains nothing that could lead to its own destruction. If you ignore external causes, a thing would just persist forever.
So if a rock is eroded by the wind, that's an external determination working against its conatus. For a living thing, how does that striving manifest?
For humans, this striving is what he often calls appetite, when we're talking about mind and body together. And then he makes a crucial distinction. Desire is simply that appetite with consciousness of the appetite.
Okay, so desire is just being aware of your appetite.
Yes. Desire is the very essence of a human being, insofar as we are conceived as being determined to some action by any given affection of ourselves.
That link to consciousness is vital because Spinoza's account of consciousness really challenges the Cartesian model.
Right.
For Spinoza, we don't start with that pure internal I think.
Right, we don't.
We are conscious of ourselves only through the ideas of the affections of the body, the states the body is in when it's affected by external things.
Our self-awareness is secondary. It's derived from our interaction with the world. The mind knows itself through its interaction with the environment, through the external objects that impact the body. If your body is affected by the warmth of the sun, your mind has an idea of that bodily affection, and that idea is your awareness of yourself and the sun at the same time.
So we mostly know ourselves through the outside world.
Yes, we only have confused, inadequate ideas about the internal structure of our own bodies and minds. Most of our conscious experience is about what's outside of us.
This perspective shift is so brilliantly captured in his famous thought experiment about the parasitic worm in the blood. Let's bring that analogy to life for a minute.
Spinoza used this in a letter to clarify his critique of this kind of anthropocentric philosophy. He says, imagine a microscopic worm living in the bloodstream. The worm observes all the blood particles moving around in a complex, seemingly unified way.
Yeah.
The worm, because its perspective is so limited, might conclude that the blood is a unified whole, regulated by some internal principle that's totally divorced from anything outside of it.
But it's wrong.
It's completely wrong. It fails to realize that the blood itself is just a tiny, determined part of a larger organism governed by the heart and the lungs, which are in turn governed by the air and the laws of nature.
And the lesson here is that the Cartesian meditator, who starts only from the subjective, I think, is just like that worm. They isolate the self and try to infer the entire universe from that isolated stance, completely missing how the mind is truly determined by the whole infinite order of nature.
Precisely. Spinoza forces us to see that our minds are determined by causes extending infinitely outwards, not by some special isolated will inside us. So the goal isn't to escape determination. It's to change the source of that determination from external, confusing causes to internal, rational ones.
How does that distinction play out when we're talking about emotions, then, and morality? What separates being passively carried along by life from being truly active?
This is the core of his ethical framework. Passions, or passive effects, are mental states that follow from inadequate ideas. They are caused primarily by external forces. They are confused, obscure ideas because they represent what's happening to the body, but without giving you a clear understanding of the external cause.
So when I feel intense anger, I'm being passively affected.
Yes, you are being determined by something external that has harmed your conatus. You're striving to persevere.
But there's a way out.
There is. Spinoza argues that if you can take that passion and achieve an adequate idea of its cause and its necessity, if you truly understand why you are angry and why that cause had to happen, then that mental state ceases to be a passion at all. Knowledge transforms passive suffering into active understanding.
So activity and freedom are intrinsically linked to knowledge.
They're synonymous. A person is active and free insofar as what they do derives from within, from the necessary striving of their own nature expressed through adequate knowledge. The mind is active when it has adequate ideas, because those ideas are caused by the mind itself, following the logical structure of God or nature. We achieve freedom not by escaping necessity, but by becoming our own adequate cause, determined solely by our rational self-understanding, rather than by the confusing chaos of external causes.
This framework leads us right to the ultimate goal of the ethics. Spinoza lays out this path to blessedness. Virtue equals knowledge, which equals activity, which equals freedom, which equals power, and ultimately perfection. This is the ascent.
The entire purpose of the book is practical. It's a guide to living the best possible life under conditions of absolute necessity. And freedom, in this Spinozistic sense, is the ultimate virtue. It's not about choosing otherwise. It's about acting solely from the necessity of one's own nature.
And for us, as finite modes, that means maximizing the clarity and adequacy of our ideas.
To be free is to understand the causal chain and to act in accordance with that understanding.
Okay, let's address the elephant in the room when it comes to morality. If we're all determined, and if Spinoza says that terms like good and evil are just relative, descriptive ways of thinking, not actual properties in nature, does his system lead to just unbridled self-interest? Is this a philosophy of pure rational egoism?
It is indeed a rational egoism, but it's one that is profoundly enlightened and ultimately communal. The dictates of reason require everyone to seek his own advantage, to preserve his own being, and to strive for his own perfection. This is simply the conatus operating rationally.
So if I'm truly rational, I seek what is best for me. Why doesn't that make me inherently hostile or indifferent to others?
Because Spinoza demonstrates that human beings are fundamentally social creatures. A person guided by reason recognizes, through the clarity of what he calls common notions, that nothing is more useful to a human being than another human being guided by reason.
Okay.
Rational self-interest compels us to seek the company of others who are also rational. We need others for safety, for mutual aid, for intellectual flourishing. The more rational and free other people are, the more they contribute to the stable, beneficial environment that allows me to flourish.
So the most selfish, rational act is to promote the rationality of others.
Exactly. This shared, necessary pursuit of self-interest fosters natural agreement and social virtue. It's why the rational person, as Spinoza famously says, hates no one, is angry with no one, envies no one. Those passions are external determinations. Rational activity dictates mutual aid.
That is a powerful transformation of egoism into social virtue.
Mm.
And this whole project rests on acquiring the right kind of understanding, which brings us to the heart of his epistemology, the three kinds of knowledge.
This is the cognitive roadmap to freedom, which he details in the second and fifth parts of the Ethics.
Okay, so the first kind.
The first kind is opinion or imagination. This is inadequate, confused, and unreliable knowledge. It's the knowledge we get when our bodies are affected by external things, generating these mutilated ideas. It often comes from memory, hearsay, or just glancing sensory perception.
Can you give us a concrete example of this inadequate knowledge?
Sure. Think about the concepts we use every day, these universals like man, dog, or chair. We form these abstract concepts because we perceive so many individual instances that our mind just groups them together, ignoring the differences and keeping only the similarities.
They're just mental shortcuts.
Exactly. They are not tied to the true essence of things. They are just clusters of images formed by the limitations of our sensory system. They're convenient for communication, but they are not reliable for philosophical truth. When you believe the sun revolves around the earth because you see it rise and set, that is the first kind of knowledge.
Okay, so the first kind is our subjective, fallible, everyday experience. What moves us beyond that to the second kind, reason?
The second kind is knowledge based on adequate ideas that we derive from common notions. Common notions are the shared properties that belong equally to all bodies. Things like extension, motion, and rest. These notions are perceived equally well by every mind because they reflect the universal structure of nature, not just the specific way my body is being affected right now.
So this is like science.
This is rational deduction. It's very similar to learning Euclidean geometry. You start with clear definitions and axioms, the common notions, and you deduce universal, reliable truths about the necessary relations of things. This is our route to scientific and rational understanding of the world.
If the second kind is rational deduction, what on earth is the third kind? Intuitive knowledge, or scientia intuitiva. This sounds like the hardest, almost mystical peak of human intellect.
It is exceedingly difficult, and Spinoza seemed to reserve it for the happy few. Intuitive knowledge transcends deduction. It proceeds instantly from an adequate idea of the formal essence of God's attributes directly to the adequate knowledge of the essence of a singular thing.
So it's not a step-by-step process.
No. Instead of deducing all bodies follow this universal law, intuitive knowledge allows you to look at one particular unique thing, a specific mountain, a specific person, and see it as following necessarily, instantly, and eternally from the infinite essence of God. You see the thing sub specie eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity. It is complete, total, immediate cognitive satisfaction.
And this final total understanding connects us directly to the ultimate goal of his ethical journey. The intellectual love of God, the amor Dei intellectualis. Is this the ultimate reward for all that hard work?
It is the pinnacle of human achievement. The intellectual love of God arises necessarily when we achieve the third kind of knowledge. Because God is the necessary structure of reality, knowing God perfectly is simultaneously experiencing the highest possible joy and satisfaction.
But it's not an emotional love.
It is not an emotional, anthropocentric love for a personal deity. It's a purely cognitive love. The mind, insofar as it understands all things as necessary consequences of God's essence, finds the supreme intellectual pleasure in perfect clarity. This knowledge is virtue, and this cognitive love is our greatest joy and the truest form of religion. And since God is infinite, this love is also eternal, contained within the divine understanding.
Speaking of eternity, Spinoza concludes the Ethics by discussing the eternity of the mind. Now, given his strict mind-body identity, this can't be the traditional promise of heaven where your discrete soul survives your body, right? That would contradict everything he's established.
That's absolutely correct. The idea of post-mortem survival of the individual self, which would mean duration continuing indefinitely, is completely incompatible with his parallelism. When the body ceases to endure, the mind, which is the idea of that specific body, must also cease to endure as a finite mode.
So what remains?
What remains eternal is that part of the mind that knows things sub specie eternitatis. The mind is eternal only insofar as it contains adequate ideas, that knowledge which exists in a timeless, necessary sense. Our eternity is not about duration continuing forever. It is about the timeless truth contained within our intellect, which is simultaneously contained within God's infinite understanding.
So the individual personal self perishes.
Yes, the self built on inadequate ideas and memory, it perishes. But the objective, adequate knowledge achieved by that mind is eternal, because it is just a part of God's necessary truth.
This journey from the single substance to the intellectual love of God is just astonishing in its rigor and scope. Let's pivot now to the real-world impact. What does this geometrically constructed philosophy actually mean for society and for history? What are Spinoza's monumental contributions?
They're massive. They touch on political freedom, religious tolerance, and even the foundation of German idealism. In political philosophy, Spinoza was a champion of liberty, even if his metaphysics was deterministic. He argued forcefully that the ideal state is a democracy.
Why democracy, specifically in a deterministic universe?
Because the goal is to maximize the power and freedom of the individual mode. Spinoza argued that a person guided by reason is actually more free in a state where they live according to rational, common decisions than they are in isolation.
So solitude is not freedom.
Solitude is a state of perpetual struggle against external chaotic forces. The state, especially a democratic one, provides the rational framework, the stable laws, the mutual agreements that allows individuals to pursue their conatus, their self-preservation, most effectively, free from arbitrary violence or fear.
Interesting.
And furthermore, his political philosophy grounded the stability of the state not in divine right or tradition, but in the need to satisfy the fundamental psychic needs of its citizens. The state must allow people to express their powers and to enjoy esteem and belonging. If it fails to do this, the citizens' rational self-interest will eventually lead them to revolt.
And this wasn't just abstract theory for him.
No, it was intimately tied to the urgent political environment of the Dutch Republic, which was grappling with religious dissent and civil order, especially after the controversial Koerbag case, where a fellow dissenter was prosecuted for his philosophical views.
One of the most groundbreaking results of his political and theological thought, laid out most clearly in the Theological Political Treatise, is this clear, monumental separation of philosophy and theology.
This separation is arguably his most significant contribution to the modern secular world. Spinoza asserts that philosophy and reason aim solely at truth, based on the analysis of nature alone. Faith and theology, on the other hand, aim solely at obedience and moral conduct based on history and sacred narratives.
So they have different goals.
Completely different goals, truth versus piety. Therefore, they occupy entirely separate domains. They cannot and should not interfere with one another. This was a revolutionary statement against the prevailing notion that philosophy was the handmaiden of theology.
So he essentially built the theoretical firewall that protects intellectual freedom.
Precisely. If theology's domain is just obedience, then theological authorities have no right to legislate on matters of reason or philosophical inquiry. This separation grants the greatest possible freedom to philosophize, which Spinoza believed was crucial for the stability of the state. It really provided the intellectual foundation for the Enlightenment.
Which leads us to his influence on later philosophy. How did this excommunicated man working in isolation go on to shape the entire trajectory of modern thought?
Well, his influence was subtle at first, but eventually it became foundational. His radical monism was the catalyst for the entire movement of German idealism. Figures like Fichte and Schelling were deeply indebted to him, and Hegel, perhaps most importantly, praised Spinozism as the essential beginning of all philosophizing.
The beginning of all philosophizing. Wow.
Hegel saw Spinoza's system as the necessary first step, because it forced thinkers to begin with the absolute, with the idea that reality is a unified, singular whole, rather than a collection of disparate things. Hegel called this Spinoza's acosmism, the negation of the finite world as having independent substance. By starting with the one infinite substance, Spinoza cleared the way for exploring how consciousness and spirit develop within that unity.
It seems like Spinoza forced everyone after him to deal with the absolute before they could talk about the particulars. Are there any more contemporary echoes of his thought?
Absolutely. His ideas are finding a resurgence in fields far outside traditional philosophy. His assertion of the identity of mind and body offers a compelling model in neurobiology and philosophy of mind. It allows scientists to move past rigid materialist or dualist accounts and explore consciousness as a deeply integrated process.
And beyond science.
In feminist theory and social philosophy, his emphasis on the striving conatus is extremely productive. Contemporary readers see Spinoza as treating all human modes equally. For instance, Eve is Adam's theoretical equal in her striving. The focus on desire, affect, and the political pressure created by this universal striving informs critical theories about how the state must satisfy psychic needs like esteem, belonging, and the realization of one's powers for a just society to exist.
This truly has been a deep dive. From geometry to neuroscience and political theory, we track the journey from the self-caused substance, God or nature, through the necessary flow, attributes, and modes. We learn that freedom is an arbitrary choice, but the ultimate self-determination you get through adequate ideas, and that the highest human joy is this intellectual love of God.
And this clarity brings us full circle to the paradox that really defined his life and his work. We are fundamentally determined beings. Every thought and action is causally fixed. Yet Spinoza spends hundreds of propositions urging us to actively strive to achieve the third kind of knowledge, to destroy our passions and to become eternal.
That is the critical tension, isn't it? If the order of the universe is already perfect and necessitated, and every idea we'll ever have is already eternally contained within God, why must the human mode expend such profound, active, and frankly arduous effort to achieve true blessedness? Why should we strive if the striving itself is already determined?
It suggests that while the event is necessary, the realization of that necessity, that subjective experience of moving from confusion to clarity, is the most challenging and meaningful form of action available to us. The goal isn't to change what happens, but to change how we participate in what happens, transforming passive determination into active self-determination. The struggle to know is, paradoxically, the truest expression of freedom. So what stands out to you about that profound requirement for active effort within a system of absolute necessity? It's a challenge to engage the world, not to resign from it.
A challenge to become a self-aware expression of the infinite, rather than just a confused flicker of the finite. Thank you for guiding us through the necessary relations of Spinoza's thought. We invite you to continue exploring the depths.